on live.
Welcome to everyone who is joining us today for the last session of the Decolonization in Focus series. My name is Zsuzsanna Magdo. I'm introducing today's panel in my dual role as Associate Director for the University of Pittsburgh Center for Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies. I also serve as Chair of the Committee for the Advocacy of Diversity and Inclusion at the Association for Slavic, East European, and Eurasian Studies. First, I want to thank our colleagues, Chris Martin and Laura Sargent at Harvard University's Davis Center. Without their expertise, dedication, and tireless work, organizing and hosting this series would not have been possible. My sincere gratitude goes also to all the institutional sponsors for supporting this effort. These include the Association and peer regional study centers at the University of Chicago, Wisconsin-Madison, Kansas, Michigan, Texas at Austin, California, Berkeley, as well as Columbia University, George Washington University, Indiana University, Bloomington, The Ohio State University, and UNC Chapel Hill. Today's topic is the future of SEEES expertise. How can we anticipate tomorrow's differences? Before I introduce our moderator, a bit of housekeeping. Please use Zoom's Q&A function to post questions for the speakers. Questions coming in through YouTube will also be shared with our moderator. As with all previous sessions, today's conversation is being live streamed, recorded for future reference, and will be available on the Davis Center's YouTube channel after we conclude. Let me introduce our moderator now. Julia Johnson is president of the Association for Slavic, East European, and Eurasian Studies, professor of political science at McGill University, and fellow of the Royal Society of Canada. She has conducted field research in the Czech Republic, Hungary, Kyrgyzstan, Russia, and Slovakia. She has received McGill's H. Noel Fieldhouse Award for Distinguished Teaching in 2007 and the David Thompson Award for Graduate Supervision and Teaching in 2018. She is the author of two books, Fistful of Rubles, The Rise and Fall of the Russian Banking System, published by Cornell University Press in 2000, and Priests of Prosperity, Transnational Central Bankers and Post-Communist Transformation, published also by Cornell University Press in 2016. This second book won the Davis Center Prize, the Schulman Prize, and the Hewitt Prize at the 2017 SEEES annual meeting. Professor Johnson also co-edited Religion and Identity in Modern Russia, The Revival of Orthodoxy and Islam, published by Ashgate in 2005. And she co-edited this volume with philosopher Marieta Stepanians and geographer Benjamin Forrest. She has published over 35 articles and book chapters, as well as numerous policy-oriented articles and op-eds. Among her many responsibilities, Professor Johnson is currently a network director of the Jean Monnet Network between the EU and Russia, Domains of Diversity and Contestation. And this is a research group spanning 11 universities and 6 countries, and studies how the EU and Russia influence minority politics, integration efforts, and societal contestation on the EU's eastern borders. Professor Johnson, thank you for shepherding today's conversation on the future of the field.
Well, thank you very much for that generous introduction. And everybody, welcome to our panel today. And certainly as AC's president, I chose the theme of decolonization for our convention this year in order to help advance the robust discussion about the state of the field that's been sparked by Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. So this last session, Decolonization in Focus, of the Decolonization in Focus series examines how the field might be impacted by a sincere effort to decolonize Slavic studies. So questions such as, how have power relationships and hierarchies within the region and beyond shaped what we study, how we study, and who has a place at the table? What does it mean to decolonize our field and to decenter Russian studies? How might calls for decolonization and decentering inform the evolution of our research, publications, syllabi, course offerings, graduate programs, and hiring practices, among others? How should area-focused centers and organizations like SEEES reflect on and transform current structures and practices? And certainly, key for us, what roles should scholars, faculty, administrators, and students play in these processes? So we have three outstanding panelists today with whom to reflect on these issues. They'll each make presentations of around 15 minutes to get us started, and then we'll open it up to questions and discussion. But first, let me introduce them to you in the order in which they will speak. First, we have Serhii Yekelchik, who is professor of history and Slavic studies at the University of Victoria and current president of the Canadian Association for Ukrainian Studies, so representing Canada as well. Born and educated in Ukraine, when it was part of the Soviet Union, he received a PhD from the University of Alberta. He's the author of 7 books on modern Ukrainian history, Stalinism, and Russo-Ukrainian relations. His monograph, Stalin's Citizens, Everyday Politics in the Wake of Total War by Oxford University Press, was the recipient of the Best Book Award from the American Association for Ukrainian Studies, and its Ukrainian translation in 2019 received a special diploma from the Lviv Book Forum. His most recent publication is the second and understandably much expanded edition of his popular book about the Euromaidan Revolution and the Russian aggression in Ukraine, What Everyone Needs to Know, from Oxford University Press. Our second speaker will be Ararat Osipyan, who is a founding fellow of the New University in Exile Consortium at the New School in New York. He's also a fellow of the Elliott School of International Affairs at the Institute for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies at the George Washington University in Washington, D.C. He holds a PhD in economics of education and human development from Vanderbilt University, where he came as a fellow of the U.S. Department of State. His research interests are broad and include corruption in higher education, corporate predatory rating, the nexus of education and economic growth, and the political economy of transition. He's the author of a variety of books such as The Economics of Growth in Russia, Overcoming the Poverty Trap, Political and Economic Transition in Russia, Predatory Rating, Privatization Reforms and Property Rights, The Political Economy of Corporate Rating in Russia, and finally, The Impact of Human Capital on Economic Growth, a case study in post-Soviet Ukraine, 1989 to 2009. And our third speaker will be Ilya Gerasimov, who is co-founder and the executive editor of Ab Imperial Quarterly, Studies of New Imperial History and Nationalism in the Post-Soviet Space. He holds degrees from 3 graduate schools in 3 countries, including a PhD in 2000 from Rutgers University and a candidate of Science and History in 1998 from Kazan State University. He specializes in the social history of the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union, progressivism as a transatlantic phenomenon, post-colonial theory, and new imperial history. He's authored 2 books in Russian and 2 in English, as well as a number of articles and book chapters published in the United States, Russia, Germany, Japan, Italy, and of course, Ukraine. So welcome, everyone. Thank you very much for agreeing to be on this panel. I'm looking forward to a great discussion, and I'll invite Serhii to get us started.
Thank you very much, Juliet, for your generous introductions. It's a great pleasure to be here. And my starting point is, of course, that this sudden relevance of our expertise came because of the war. And that's not the moment we would celebrate as the moment when the field discovers the importance of thinking through Russia's imperial dimension and understanding the role of Ukraine in the world in which we live. But nevertheless, we take what we have. And I have to say that I was very much pleasantly surprised by the reaction of colleagues in the field here in Canada and in the United States and globally, who were really open-minded and trying to help in practical things, but also in terms of rethinking what we do, how we do it, and what approaches could help us to prepare our students and the public better for events like the all-out invasion of the Russian Federation in February 2022. Of course, people in my field, in my more immediate field, modern Ukrainian history, would say right away, you know what? The war has been going on since 2014. Why did it take an all-out invasion and enormous casualties in 2022 for us to actually really wake up? And that is a very valid question, I think. I think there is a bit of an institutional inertia in the field of modern Soviet history, in which I also position myself because my work involves Stalinism and cultural history of the Soviet Union. And that institutional inertia has something to do not just with the structure of our field, such as the nature of academic schools, the nature of appointments and courses we teach, and the kinds of programs we consider ourselves part of, but also more generally with the kind of dynamics, perhaps in a delayed reflection of relations between Russia and the West. And I think this is our moment to recognize it, that we are in a way hostages of what is happening at the international scene. And it's not incidental. It's not an exception that so many colleagues, particularly in Europe, found themselves in the countries in which there was a significant sympathy to Mr. Putin's regime. And in fact, significant support for the work which would justify Mr. Putin's actions from this or that angle. And so, therefore, there's a larger context which we need to include, and that context goes way beyond the academia. It goes beyond what we write and what we teach. It goes beyond our students, and it actually requires us to become public historians and public political scientists. I think this term is well developed in the field of history. The term public historian is accepted. In fact, my own department actually has a master's program in public history, and I had the pleasure of sitting on the committee at one point developing this program. So here we are. We need to acknowledge our public role in addition to our role as scholars and educators. And it is a moment of responsibility for which we were not necessarily well prepared by our training. So when I travel quite a bit recently, especially to the US, and I interact with a number of colleagues who are wonderful people, some of whom, in fact, have volunteered on the Polish border to assist the Ukrainian refugees there. But I see that their programs actually lack an institutional dimension which would allow them to teach differently. And here there are a few moments I'd like to mention. One is, in fact, the presence of positions for people specifically who deal with the imperial dimension of Russia. And I think that dimension somehow got overlooked during the transition of our field from studying mostly primarily Russia proper to studying the borderlands of the empire. And that would be Central Asia primarily in the early 2000s, the Caucasus around the same time, and now suddenly Ukraine coming into the circulation as an important part of it as well. But I'm afraid we were really concerned for a long time for understanding the social and cultural history of Russia itself. And when we say Russia, we very often conflated the Russian Empire and Russia. I see that all the time. In fact, just yesterday, I was invited to give comments at a presentation at one major research center in the field. So upon receiving the link, it turned out that I wasn't available on that day. But upon receiving the link, I went to see how this center imagines itself and how this program, in fact, imagines itself. And it was all about Russia. But the invitation actually mentioned Russia and the Russian Empire. And then I realized that "and the Russian Empire" was in fact added just for my benefit and for that particular occasion in realizing that I'm a historian of Ukraine. The moment you follow the link, it's all about Russia, and of course, Russia, what is Russia, is a very big question. And we do not necessarily arrive at it just by, having people in our field, a certain part of people in our field specializing in, let's say, Central Asia, Caucasus, and Ukraine. This is a bigger issue. I also assigned an article to my students this semester in my course on modern Ukraine and the Russo-Ukrainian War, written by a prominent specialist in international relations, including the Soviet Union and Russia. And that article started with a sentence of Crimea had been part of Russia since it was conquered in 1783 and until Khrushchev gave it to Ukraine in 1954. And I actually had students, not even history majors, asking me, can you actually say this? Because, of course, it's not the same Russia in 1954 and in 1783. And of course, everything is part of Russia in 1783. Poland, parts of Poland belong to Russia. There are all kinds of things that belong to Russia, but that is not, in fact, Russia. It is the Russian Empire, to which significant chunks of Ukraine belong as well at that point. And so this lack of reflection and the convenience, like the easy convenience of conflating Russia with the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union, actually made me understand that this is the point to make. And in my public talks recently, and in my teaching as well, I'm now making a point of emphasizing what kind of a difficulty it would lead you into if you were to continue conflating Russia with the Russian Federation of today, with the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union all at the same time. And my point is often has something to do with hockey, especially teaching in Canada, and that moment when the Canadian hockey commentators have to come to terms with the thing that playing Russia was actually playing the Soviet Union, right? And there is now a Russian team as well. And also for students, it is the moment when there are suddenly two presidents in Russia, except one of them is Gorbachev, president of the Soviet Union, and the other is Yeltsin, the president of Russia. And they don't like each other particularly, really. And so searching for the moments which in fact fight against, kind of critically undermine this unspoken assumption that you can really say that Crimea became part of Russia in 1783, and then go on to say that until Khrushchev gave it to Ukraine in 1954. So when this becomes impossible in our field and the general public acquires an understanding that there is something really important that we are affirming by this rather thoughtless equation. And that is, of course, power and power hierarchy and the possibility of imagining empires as eternal in a way, and also having the cultural hierarchies that are eternal in cultural sense. And here I arrive, of course, at the second part of my appointment. And I happen to be cross-appointed in the Department of Germanic and Slavic Studies, where my office is, really. So my students in history come to look for me in Slavic Studies. And I always take a moment to tell them, by the way, you can take languages here. Another teachable moment. But of course, there too, a similar transition is underway. And it's not always easy to revise a program, even when you deal with the most supportive colleague. And I was blessed, in fact, I am blessed with having the specialist on the Russian language, who was first of us, regardless of her dual citizenship. She was the one who led our drive to break relations with the Russian embassy, to realign our exchange programs. I'm really proud to say that that was, in fact, a person with Russian citizenship who was a leader in this respect in my other department. But that, of course, goes beyond our political understanding that things cannot go on the way they have been, because it really involves a redefinition and rethinking of the field of Slavic studies. So we are in the process of actually trying to detach ourselves from that overwhelming emphasis on Russian culture, which in the field still has some elements of, like, I traveled to Russia, I really liked it. Therefore, I'm going to specialize in Russian studies. But that is precisely the wrong reason, of course, to specialize in the field, because you come into it without the critical distance between yourself and your subject. So myself and my colleagues are now discovering for ourselves such things as the Czech Renaissance, as the number of Nobel Prize winners in Polish literature, as the minority groups in Eastern Europe, which in fact ended up never having a state or never having their culture studied, except it so happened that in my department, we used to have a specialist on those Slavs who ended up living in modern Germany. So, and I think we are in the process of undermining a really powerful narrative and constructing a new one, which we need to keep open. So there would be nothing worse than basically replacing one orthodoxy with the other one. And I'm particularly aware of that as a historian of Ukraine and a specialist also on Ukrainian culture, that it does not really mean that we need to institute the new orthodoxy, that Ukrainian nationalism is the greatest thing that ever happened to the Russian Empire, even if sometimes I think just like that, right? So, and here there is in fact another source for us to turn to. And I'm, by the way, expecting Julia to signal me when I'm going way over my limit. And the other resource is in fact, for me in this particular case, in fact, Ukraine. Because for those who follow the way Ukrainian school curriculum is and the textbooks are, we usually talk about, you know, the problem of lionization, nationalists without maintaining critical distance to them. But there is something else, and that is actually the recent inclusion of the Crimea into the narratives of Ukrainian history and culture in a powerful way, by acknowledging that the Crimean Tatars are another nation who share the motherland with Ukrainians. And from that, of course, it follows that you have a very violent history between the Crimean Tatars and Ukraine. And that history has now been rewritten from the position of the present, in which it is the human rights that matter. And also, there is actually another history with lots of blood between the two nations, and that would be Ukraine and Poland, which I think is the next direction where we really need to go, because for all of these disagreements and debates about ethnic cleansing in 1943 and lots of violence in the 20th century and beyond in the early modern period, it is now sufficiently clear that there is people's diplomacy happening between Ukraine and Poland. So whether we like the current Polish or Ukrainian government for that matter or not, there is actually the fact that the families are coming together. And I'm really hopeful that that would be the moment when the two countries renew the process of reconciliation, when they find the strength to look critically at historical heroes and acknowledge that the most important thing is that the people are in fact together now in fighting, in helping the Ukrainian refugees in Poland. So these are a few moments, some of them teachable, some of them moments for further reflection. I'm aware that some of them also include inner contradictions, which would need to be addressed. And that's why my warning, my final warning was in fact about not creating a new orthodoxy, but staying critical of the grand narratives. And I do hope that this lesson would transform the field, but I do realize it will take significant time and effort. But if not now, then when? Thank you.
Indeed, if not now, when? Because the danger is that we lose momentum. So Serhii, thank you very much for your thoughtful comments. And now we'll turn to Ararat.
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you. I should mention first that I added one more title to my bio. I added it about a year ago. In fact, it wasn't me exactly. It's Russia that did it. I am now an IDP, which stands for internally displaced person, and means being a refugee in my own land. I have an official status of an IDP in Ukraine, which implies quite a bit of hardship, I would say, but it also gives me a lot of opportunities in terms of doing field work, being in this really important place for the entire post-Soviet territory and the entire world being here in Ukraine. My suggestion for the field in as far as Ukraine is concerned, to try to avoid standard narratives and maybe cliches and standard approaches, and probably not to divide Ukrainian modern history, very modern history, on before Euromaidan of 2014 and after Euromaidan of 2014, because in some writings I see things like before 2014, prior to Euromaidan, it was Russia and a lot of corruption, Russian influence and a lot of corruption in Ukraine, Yanukovych's Ukraine. And after Euromaidan took place, now it is Ukraine is more of no Russia, or some people call it non-Russia, and no corruption and no Russian influence. And this is certainly not the case. I observed Ukraine in 2014. I was in Donbass during the war of 2014, and I was in Donbass in 2022, the day that major Russian offensive started, and many times in between. And so I can say that Russian influence was very, very exceptionally, extremely significant in Ukraine, even after Euromaidan of 2014. And I will give you a few illustrations from my fieldwork. One such illustration is a plant somewhere in Donbass, metallurgy plant, which produces very important parts for Russia's brand new fleet of icebreakers, nuclear icebreakers, with which Russia is going to gain even more influence in the Arctic, as the Arctic becomes more important. So this plant have been producing those parts for Russian nuclear, brand new Russian nuclear icebreakers prior to 2014. And then it kept working and producing and supplying those parts to Russia even after the Crimea was annexed by Russia. And even after the war in Donbass took place in 2014 and 15, major military action, meaning. And there were tens of thousands, casualties were in tens of thousands. But that didn't impact. In fact, people at the plant were very happy that they keep getting orders from Russia. And even more surprisingly, that plant actually belonged to Russian business, not just a private business, but a Russian nuclear agency, Rosatom, which is a state agency funded certainly from a Russian federal budget. And what's even more surprising is part of this plant, it was in part owned by a member of parliament, not Russian parliament, not the State Duma, but a member of Ukrainian parliament. So here you see this amazing, you can watch it prior to Euromaidan, prior to the war in Donbass, and think, well, this is just economic cooperation based on old Soviet economic ties. This is normal. But when you see it after 2014, that seems very unusual. And yet that was a fact. And that plant was still working and working until it was actually hit by missiles after the February 22nd of February 24th of 2022, when the major offensive took place. So finally it stopped, and many workers evacuated, etc. But that gives a good idea how influential Russia was in Ukraine, and how you know, it really penetrated many aspects of life of Ukrainians, including businessmen, politicians, and ordinary people, workers of this plant, for instance. But then, with this major offensive in February of 2022, that's, I think, where Ukraine really and significantly started departing Russia. Now, something like this would be unimaginable. But although sometimes Ukrainian state security forces discover one private business or the other, which was until recently supplying some parts for Russian military equipment or something like this, but these are very rare exceptions. So the point of real departure is 2022. 2014 Euromaidan was a good start, but the real departure of Ukraine away from Russia, I believe, is 2022. And while the war in Donbass was going on, and then in 2016 and 2017, the volume of trade between Ukraine and Russia was actually increasing. And I believe around 2018, Ukraine said Russia is no longer our major trade partner, it's now China. But I would think, as an economist, I would think if you account for all the very significant labor migration of Ukrainians to Russia, which was going on for decades, if you account for informal economic ties and transfer of economic assets, maybe at that year, even Russia would still be the major trade partner with Ukraine ahead of even China. Now, just another illustration of those really confusing things. I remember a military parade in Ukraine, I believe it was 2018, not in Kiev, but in one of small cities, small towns in Donbass, already ravaged by war. And here, Ukrainian military marching, and on the background, you see the poster of a Russian savings bank, Sberbank. In Ukraine, it's Oshadbank. And you look at it and you think, well, how is that possible? Here is a military parade commemorating, celebrating Ukrainian independence, and in Donbass, taking place in Donbass, and it's on the background of the poster of Russian Sberbank, which is not only one of the largest Russian banks, it's actually a state-owned bank in Russia. So that these things were really confusing especially for people of Donbass, because on the one hand, they survived those very serious military action of 2014 and early 2015 prior to the Minsk, second Minsk Accord sign, or yet on the other hand, you see such things, and it's surprising. So, but now Ukraine is totally moving away from Russia. But if you think of it as Ukraine being decolonized and moving away from Russia, then some people start talking about strengthening influence of the West in Ukraine. And starting February 2022, it's very obvious. First of all, it's military aid, and it counts in tens of billions of dollars. And it's also humanitarian aid. But it's also a more serious involvement of major international organizations, not only in terms of providing humanitarian aid to people in Ukraine who need it, but also trying to reform Ukraine, to make it better, to make it aligned more with Western standards than departing from old Soviet standards. And that's what I'm currently working on. It's part of my focus. It's when the World Bank comes to Ukraine. The World Bank had been in Ukraine since 1992. What I'm talking about specifically is the World Bank's project in higher education, which the World Bank was dealing with Ukraine's higher education for over 15 years, I believe. And finally, which happened right on the eve of the war, sometime in the late fall of 2021, the World Bank came to Ukraine with a project on improving higher education for results. With a reasonably big budget of $200 million, which is sounds very small by US standards, but for Ukraine, it's a significant amount of money for Ukraine's higher education. And I looked into this project. I had conversations with someone who directs the project now, and I had that conversation at the World Bank in DC at least 2 years prior to the start of the project. And my impression was that they have a good understanding of Ukraine, but they are not sure about all the challenges that they're going to face in Ukraine, including the Soviet Stalinist structure of higher education, and including this enormous and endemic corruption which you can find in Ukraine's higher education. So they came in, and as in many other nations that happened, there were protests in Ukraine among the constituents, among faculty and students of higher education institutions, not as much against the World Bank directly or Western influence directly, but against what it implied, and it implied, among other things, university mergers. And in Ukraine, every university president wants to be a real boss in his or her university, doesn't want to share any power, and certainly in no way wants to lose his office by merging with another university. And what they did for the public, they converted this whole discussion into a narrative of his Western influence, and it's not good, because we are on our own, we are autonomous higher education institutions, and we don't like to join other higher education institutions because we are better. And it's all that World Bank, which they, by the way, in the media, they sometimes confuse it with the IMF. Now, the IMF has nothing to do with higher education. They only deal with finance and national currency. But they were portraying it as he is the bad influence of the West, the IMF, and the World Bank. Now, with that full-scale war starting February 2022, in addition to those challenges of student protests, university mergers, corruption, we didn't go anywhere, certainly. Now there is a war, including direct missile hits into some of the Ukrainian top universities. In fact, during the very first few days, at the Department of Faculty of Economics and Sociology of Kharkov, Kharkov National University in Kharkiv was hit by Russian missile and destroyed. I spent a whole decade of 1990s in that very building. And when I watched it, I just couldn't believe that this happened. And since then, many more higher education institutions suffered serious damage. And one would expect from international organizations such as the World Bank and USAID to have more influence, to come with more funds. And but what this particular project, in order to rebuild for reconstruction and development of Ukrainian higher education institutions, but What the World Bank did with at least half of its budget, given the circumstances, given the situation, they agreed with the Ukrainian government to channel it as immediate emergency relief funds to pay stipends to students. So they would have at least some financial means, some money to survive in such difficult circumstances. So they allocated half of their project's budget immediately. It's around $100 million. And then they allocated another $10 million and then another. And so the project, which was designed to be implemented in Ukraine over the 5-year period, its budget was almost depleted within first 6 months. And so the question is, well, what will happen next with this project? I mean, how people in Ukraine, the academia will regard this Western influence if not much was accomplished. And then the money went to stipends, which is very nice, but it's just an emergency relief. So will they again blame the World Bank and say that departure from this kind of a colonial or dependency status from Russia was too soon or too fast? My thought is that more effort should be done on the side of Western partners in terms of reconstruction and development, and giving more funds to Ukraine, not only in terms of arms and humanitarian aid, but also in terms of rebuilding Ukraine's infrastructure in broader terms, meaning education and higher education in particular, and healthcare and such. So my other thought is about corruption once again, because in Ukraine there is now, I would say, official, or at least not necessarily official, but for those anti-corruption activists, is forget about blaming Ukraine for its corruption. We need support. We need, military support. We need to win this war, and it's not time to discuss corruption. And I certainly think that the field of Slavic and European and Eurasian studies should indeed focus more on the issue of corruption, including corruption in Ukraine, because it erodes values, it erodes people's beliefs, and it erodes humanitarian aid as well, because corruption didn't disappear anywhere in Ukraine. It still is everywhere. And there are many criminal cases opened just about every day on people misappropriating Western aid. So my thoughts are those that on the one hand, it's very useful to do field work, as including and especially so in a manner of direct participant observation as a golden standard for such works, especially for ethnographics and sociology. But on the other hand, as I remember how people were evacuating from Ukraine or from Eastern Ukraine and Kiev to Western Ukraine, and remembering all those poor international students evacuating from the country, trying to leave the country, I would think that people, scholars in the field, should really start thinking how safe it is. That's the thing of countering this precious experiences of field work with safety concerns. Of course, one thing is if you fly to Warsaw, Poland, and then take a nice train to Lviv. And that's one way of visiting Ukraine, but another way of visiting Ukraine and doing your field work is going to places like Donbass or Kharkiv or Kherson. And that is still very dangerous. So that should be very serious consideration for scholars who want to study the post-Soviet space. And I think that should go not only to Ukraine, but to other post-Soviet countries like Moldova or Kazakhstan, for instance, because what happens in Ukraine shows how fast things can develop. And so scholars can find themselves in really serious and immediate danger, and sometimes they wouldn't even time to get to the international airport or to run to your consulate or to seek protection. So that would probably be my final advice. And I don't know how I'm doing on time.
I've been messaging you. You're a bit over it. Yes.
Okay, sorry. So let me just stop here and thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Arat. And I want to remind our audience that you don't have to wait until everybody's done talking to send questions. Please type your questions in, and it'll help me out if I have some to work with right after the comments are done. So with that note, Ilya, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me to this panel. Like Sergey, I'm a historian and will speak as historian, and partly building my argument on what Sergey already was saying. Although I would say having historians on the panel on the future of SEEES expertise, how can we anticipate tomorrow's differences, seems a bit might seem counterintuitive. Historians speaking about expertise, which implies practical application of knowledge and the future. Typically, when historians are trying to be useful, they provide historical substantiation to the ruling regime's legitimacy, territorial claims, or national identity. Well, I see the historian's social mission differently. I believe that historians are valuable not because they know chronology and collect facts about the past. Our social function is to forge new possibilities for social imagination. Human brain cannot just generate something absolutely unthinkable, while history never repeats itself, and each of us faces new challenges under new circumstances, unprecedented in the past. But the only social reality that we have time to analyze is in the past. By rethinking the past, we forge the analytical language and models that we inevitably apply to analyze the social reality today and contemplate the future. A few people are trained as social scientists in political science, but practically everyone are exposed to history from childhood. And the way we make sense of the past directly informs our social imagination. So what's important is not so much what we learn about the past, but how we perceive it. This brings me to the first panel in the series, and I reviewed all the previous panels. And at this first panel, Marina McGillen recalled to take, and I quote, the decolonizing claim as an epistemological challenge to go beyond sporadic inclusions of imperial peripheries in mainstream teaching and research, what Sergey mentioned, and start the difficult epistemological work on our analytical apparatus. Only through epistemological reflection can be expected to deliver real decolonization of our field, end quote. Obviously, because of the Russian aggression, of full-scale aggression in Ukraine, and because the decolonization discussion is largely framed by the modern American context of cultural wars, premised on identity politics, this path of epistemological reflection, I would say, largely remains not taken. Too often that not decolonization takes the form of a political campaign targeting ideas, interpretations, identified as colonial and promoting various national narratives as an alternative. And here's the tricky aspect of the very term decolonization. Should we understand it as part of anti-colonial or post-colonial movement? Most decolonizers nowadays, it's my experience, don't read much on the subject, don't see much of a difference between the anti and the post. And indeed, post-colonial theory is so multifaceted, and certainly there can be no single correct definition of post-colonial, how to think about post-colonial situation. Well, I suggest that the meaningful way to use the two different terms, and they are available and they're often interchangeably and critically used. So to make these two different, the distinction meaningful is to make analytical distinction between the two. Anti-colonial is aimed at the figure of the oppressor, as the oppressor itself. While post-colonial strive to dismantle the very structures of hegemony and oppression. As we learned from the subaltern studies long ago, after the national liberation movement topples the colonial domination, nationalism assumes the role of the new hegemon, so that the imperial structures of hegemony persist under new facade for many decades after the empire is gone, and are easily recognizable by historians and social scientists. So the anti-colonial is about perpetuating the structures of dependence. Think about the Soviet Union's obsession with the bloody legacy of Tsarism. Every Soviet success had to be measured against the Russian Empire in the year 1913. Did the revolution of 1917 topple the Russian Empire? Yes. Did the fixation on Tsarism eliminate imperial structures of hegemony? No. And some scholars would argue that the Soviet structures of imperial hegemony were even more powerful and efficient than the all-imperial ones. Post-colonial liberation is like getting over domestic abuse. And this is not, it's just in comparison. It's not an analytical way to perceive it. But in systemic domestic abuse, when you go over it, you don't forget the real injustice and abuses in the past. You just no longer allow them to frame your worldview. You go on with your life, finding new meaning in it. For this, you need to start thinking differently, deconstructing the situation of hegemony and dependence. This is what decolonization should be about, forging a new way of contemplating social groupness, finding a new episteme. Otherwise, the same episteme is shared by the colonizers and decolonizers, whose main disagreement seems to be about which national history should be central, that of nation A or of nation B. In other words, should the historical narrative be framed by history of nation A, arriving through trials and tribulation at the ultimate price of state sovereignty, or the nation B, whose monuments to preserve, whose to dismantle? Political difference between the two can be enormous, but the logic and culture of analysis based on essentializing social identity and groupness remains the same. And the same remains the colonial potential of prioritizing one group at the expense of marginalizing the other. This is why McGillner called for epistemological deconstruction as the only practical way to change reality, by changing the ways we analyze it. This can be done only in dialogue of historians and social scientists, poli-sci folks, sociologists, anthropologists. We historians need analytical language of critical theory, while critical theory needs verification and falsification through case studies that are most comprehensively analyzed and deconstructed by historians. Without proper historicizing, critical theory is just normative discourse bordering on ideology. Incidentally, SEEES, our association, provides the format for such exactly this kind of interdisciplinary conversation focused on the same region, just as this series on decolonization are. Moreover, the field formerly known as Russian history, and I've been using this formula formerly known as Russian history since 2010, for more than 30 years now. This field is unique, being probably the first one designed as transnational history from the very beginning. Yes, the name is obsolete, just as Slavic studies, all these are relics of the early 20th century American social imagination and rhetoric. Yet, at least from the mid-20th century, our field was developing a strong potential for transcending isolationist national histories. First, it has been centered in North America rather than in the region. And it has become clear now that it's not a bug, but a feature. The center of German history is Germany. The center of French history is in Paris, not in New Jersey. But Russian history, whatever they call it, Russian history, is centered in America, not only in North America, not only because of the Cold War, which was over 30 years ago, but because of its principled extraterritoriality. It's not a national history of the Russian Federation and doesn't service Russia exclusively, something what Sergei was talking about earlier. Second, it's a history of all regions and all ethnocultural groups in what can be called alternatively, if awkwardly, Northern Eurasia, which are necessarily studied in a transnational, if not global context. At least this was the original assumption that professors of Russian history could be specialists in Georgian or Uzbek history, Ukrainian, and Tatar. It's only in the capacity of Russian historians as an umbrella designation, certainly, that it was possible to secure many hundreds, if not thousands, of university positions and create this association. It's centered in North America because no other country or European Union as a subnational entity can be compared in terms of job market and the student body to North America, which was possible only because Russian history was never about area studies. It was about this, at least potentially, transnational complex joint inquiry. True, there has been a visible trend in concentrating on Russian language sources and Moscow, St. Petersburg. And I would say that particularly in Soviet history, in empire studies that I monitor even more closely than Soviet studies for the past quarter century, we don't see successful and professional scholarship which be Russocentric and blind to the problem of imperial domination and colonialism. Soviet history is another matter. And now this is a bug. There is nothing inherently Russocentric in the composition of our field, which is remarkably modern and robust in its transnational and global history segment. It doesn't have to be called Russian history or Russian studies, although even at this basic level, I see the complete neglect for epistemological analytical work in the calls for derussification. In English, just as in Ukrainian, there is still just one word for the two very different notions, Ruski and Rossiyski, denoting ethno-confessional groupness and political or regional belonging. What do you mean by derussification? What part of this complex notion you're addressing? You're dismantling our transnational field or just Russocentrism that would become all too visible in some segments of this field? I agree that our field should not be Ruski, but I find its strength in its transnational scope, which used to be identified as Russian or Soviet. We can find new name for it, or purge the term Russian of ethno-confessional Russianness and deprive the Russian Federation of the monopoly over the common, conflicting, but entangled history, and even over modern Russian language, which was the literary Russian language was designed in late 18th century as imperial language, artificial, based on 3 different sources, one of which was Ukrainian, along with Central Russian and North Russian dialects or languages. And Russian language is as global phenomena as the world English is. and shouldn't be regarded as a property of Russian Federation and Institute of Language in Moscow. And each local version deserves its own, it stands by its own, with its grammar, with its vocabulary, and so on. Either way, I see the future of our professional expertise as interdisciplinary and transnational, for which ACES provides such a unique format. We cannot anticipate tomorrow's differences, just we can't anticipate new sensibilities and hence new criticism of the past that would emerge in 5 years or in 10 years. What we can do is to develop the culture of analytical critical inquiry, collegial and transnational, substantiating not group identities, but moral values, civic values, even more so, and providing our societies with newer, truly liberating forms of social imagination. Alas, the only thing that history teaches us is that no group can claim moral superiority in the past, and that nothing that happened in the past automatically predetermines the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ilya. And of course, I endorse your call for embracing our transnational and interdisciplinary nature as scholars and people who have committed our lives to working in understanding the region. So again, please keep sending your questions. We've got some good ones already. I'm going to start off with 2 questions, and they're the first 2 that I got, which both touch on the same kind of issue, and that is looking at the question of decolonization in the broader sense of the word. The first question asks, scholars have been documenting the history of decolonization for decades. As a rule, they do not include the Soviet Union and the post-Soviet space in their accounts. What might explain this fact? And the second question is, how would the decision of Ukraine to decolonize from Russia and westernize by choosing to align with Europe, in quotation marks, and seeking the opportunity to join the European Union and possibly later NATO, be perceived by what we refer to as the global South, again in quotation marks? In the global South, it is precisely the West that is seen as the source of colonization and of modernity and coloniality. Can Ukraine's choice problematize the decolonial option of the global South? Is there dialogue possible here? So I would invite you each to react to that. Who wants to go first? I will choose somebody if you don't volunteer. Zahi.
I think historically the notion of colonization developed in a certain political configuration in which the Soviet Union was seen as a force for decolonization. The notion that a hard left empire is possible took some time, I think, to establish itself. There existed indeed such a trend, especially in North American scholarship back in the late 1940s and 50s, which looked at the Soviet Union through very different lenses. But the historic moment of defining decolonization was in fact produced by intellectuals of colonial nations who are very often looking at the Soviet Union as a potential beacon of freedom, idealizing in a profound way, in fact, Soviet policies in various regions, particularly in Central Asia, I would think. That would have opened quite the eyes of quite a few scholars if that was examined back then in the 60s and 70s, the way it was examined by a number of colleagues in the field, starting in the late 1990s and 2000s. So there is then the historic configuration in which it is the left which needs to rethink its own vision of the Soviet Union. Then there is also our awareness, and here I think I'm linking it to the second question, about the multiple ways of imagining decolonization, also the multiple ways of imagining coloniality. So very often, in fact, in my field, the notion that Ukraine is undergoing this anti-colonial and post-colonial transition is met with a response by historians saying that Ukraine never was a classic colony, and it is somehow demeaning even to insist that it was a colony. To which, of course, my answer right away is, how about the prohibitions on the use of Ukrainian language in print? At which point, the said colleagues right away start agreeing that, yeah, this is a classic colonial policy trying to suppress the identity. There is a, in terms of cultural history and cultural hierarchies, it is actually quite easy to make a case. But it also means that we need to redefine our understanding of what colonialism is and what decolonization is, right? So in a way, when universities in the UK and some parts of the UK start using Gaelic on websites, and you suddenly get bilingual websites, that too is decolonization. Also, it does not necessarily fit with a classic understanding stemming from the 60s and 70s. So I think we need to problematize the notion of decolonization, but also, of course, to question the notion of what instruments you use. The fact that Europe is used by Ukraine in this respect is in fact not at all contradictory. This is what you would encounter in post-colonial studies all over the place, because these new identities are constructed precisely in dialogue with in fact the colonizer from the same bricks established by the process of colonization. And don't forget, though, that the Soviet Union was also very much a part of Europe. And Marxism was something very European for the Soviet Union. And the insistence on the modernity, on Soviet modernity, was so much similar to the insistence by colonial powers that they are bringing this civilization and modernity. So what Ukraine does is, of course, using Europe as a metaphor, and it's not a surprising metaphor. It's, in fact, an unexpected metaphor. It makes perfect sense that it wants to use the language of, let's say, colonial modernity precisely to liberate itself from the cultural domination. I think the process which you observe there is, in fact, very much part of what we see in the world of decolonization now. You cannot really get away from the colonizer. And what is even more difficult, you cannot truly transition, I think, to the post-colonial way of thinking through, unless the colonizer is involved in the process. So in fact, Russia's refusal to acknowledge being an empire and to acknowledge the way it treated Ukraine and is treating Ukraine now with military force is one factor why the transition to post-colonial way of looking at empires is so difficult in Ukraine. And therefore, Ukraine is in fact locked in this anti-colonial thing, which is a major explanation of why you have the lionized figures of Ukrainian nationalist leaders who do not necessarily fit well with the notions of human rights and modern worldview. So these things are ultimately connected, and I see that Ararat is itching to say something on this very same topic.
Yes, thank you. As Ukrainians clearly have now departed from Russia in 2022 with this absolutely crazy tragic event, this ongoing full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine. Well, one has to keep in mind that Ukraine has to embrace European values in terms of you're absolutely right, in terms of human rights in the various dimensions. But in terms of the rule of law, which was and still is always a problem, and in terms of corruption, because the European Union will not be ready to accept Ukraine and give it full membership as long as Ukraine suffers of serious levels of corruption. And another thing is economic ties. You know, the war is a tragedy. Politics is important, diplomacy, but economic ties are very important. I think one serious mistake that Ukraine has done over decades of its post-Soviet development is that it wasn't really reoriented its national economy more towards the West, towards the European Union. But those same Soviet ties that Ukraine inherited from the Soviet plan and directive economy, then preserved in terms of economic relations with Russia. And many enterprises, machinery, metallurgy, and many other branches of the national economy were still oriented mostly on the post-Soviet market. It was a very closed market, mostly on Russia and Kazakhstan. And so if Ukraine really wants to burn the bridges with Russia economically, it has to integrate into the global economy, primarily due to the geographic closeness to the European Union. And you may find surprising that, for instance, someone in America with the US credit card recognized and welcomed all over the world, you cannot buy things online in Ukraine. You still cannot even buy a ticket on Ukrzaliznytsia, Ukraine railway stations, if you are in the US using US credit card. So we are talking about all of this artificial intelligence and globalization and how Ukraine is integrating, etc., etc. But there are things that were not done, have not been done over more than 3 decades of post-Soviet development in Ukraine. So one thing is to depart from Russia, another thing is to integrate with the West, with the European Union. This is not one and the same thing. Ukrainians tend to believe that there is this tragedy, there is this terrible war with Russia, which means that we are doomed to become NATO members and being accepted in the European Union. That is just a matter of time. In fact, matter of just a few years, if not months. And it's hard to believe in this way of thinking. It's hard to believe in this way of seeing things, because Ukraine really has to reform itself and transform itself before it will be able to integrate into the West. Thank you.
All right. Although I wouldn't want to overestimate the extent to which the the West is free of corruption itself. I mean, the European Union is rife with corruption. I just my class just read Alex Cooley and John Heatherthrow's book Dictators Without Borders this past week, which is really all about how financial globalization in the Western financial system facilitates and encourages corruption in the post-Soviet and post-communist space. So I think we have to look in both directions there. And also, I remember when I moved to Canada, my credit history was wiped out. Globalization is not all what we may think it is, and certainly I can't use my Canadian credit card to order something on Amazon US, for example. So there's again, there's not as much of a difference as we might as we might think sometimes. Ilya, did you want to add to this conversation?
Well, at any, I should not probably, because this conversation is overshadowed by the reality of Russian aggression. So while I have purely analytical criticism of the approach by my Ukrainian colleagues, I mean, it doesn't look, I mean, it's just inappropriate to voice it right now when exactly the point, the point is that Ukrainian, as I argued many years ago, Ukrainian Euromaidan was the first post-colonial revolution on record because it was really not against anything. It was the revolution, self-proclaimed revolution of dignity. And this gave hope after a quarter of century of this endless post-Soviet transit for new meanings and self-sufficiency being developed in the region. Because looking for instant ready solutions in some West, which is in deep institutional crisis, and it's not West's crisis, it's the crisis of the modern state and the modern nation state, which is discussion for another day. With people in the United States or Germany and in Paris having no ready solutions to this crisis, how to restore legitimacy of the state, which the social state, the welfare state, the post-World War II project is actually in perils now. So expecting that there is something that can solve all the solutions and provide new meaning and the answer to the key question, why should we live in this country together? And with whom? Who are in and who are out? How we define citizenship and what qualifies one as citizen? Without providing local, meaningful answers to this question, no post-colonial, achieving post-colonial situation is possible. But the main target of Putin's war is exactly, for besides purely technical geopolitical reasons, it's because also Ukraine was in the vanguard of this post-Soviet difficult transit, producing along with Belarusians bits and pieces of this future post-colonial arrangement, new approaches to multiculturalism, which is endemic to our region. And of course, the polarizing effect of war, the boost of the need to resist and mobilize the nation along the old mid-20th century scenarios. You just cannot ignore this reality. You cannot criticize nationalists, as Sergei also mentioned, for being patriots and being on the front line of defending the country. So this is a very, I mean, the most important thing is that people are suffering and murdered in Ukraine. But beside this immediate, most obvious and most heartbreaking aspect, there is a major blow delivered to the prospects of this post-Soviet transit as truly post-colonial accommodation of the region, which was thrown back to the decades ago. So while I don't believe that the West is the answer, it's just meaningless to answer that, to argue that without NATO support, without political support from the West, Ukraine's future is feasible right now. So this is the truly dramatic, intellectually dramatic situation we find ourselves in.
Right, thank you.
But still, answering the second question by Sean, I have to say that we still, those of us who are not in the country, not in Ukraine, not under bombing, our civic duty as citizens of the Republic of Letters and of Knowledge, or Empire of Knowledge, with all these its inequalities, our civic duty is to try to be as analytical and keep politicization down, because this is what in the end, this is how in the end we can contribute to Ukraine prevailing over Russian aggression of nationalism that is produced by Putin primarily for Russia, which he failed to do this for 2 decades, but by the side effect of this is that it certainly restores this nationalist mobilization in Ukraine, and at least we try to keep our analytical procedures less politicized.
Well, yeah, Ilya, the audience can't actually see the question, so let me ask it now and open it up more widely. And indeed, this is a question that Sean asked. The AC's annual convention call for proposals treats decolonization as, quote, a profoundly political act, unquote. In encouraging the decolonization of the field, are we also encouraging the politicization of SEEES, which risks making the knowledge we produce look increasingly like the propaganda we decry? And full disclosure, I wrote the call for proposals, but much of it depends what you consider to be political and a political act. I'm a political scientist, right? So I fully agree with Ilya that what we can contribute is a commitment to analysis, to evidence, to doing our work as scholars. But I would also argue that the field has always been political, and it depends what you mean by political, right? And I'm supposed to be the moderator here, not a commentator, so I think I'll let Serhii say something about this. But I think it's important to be while we're being analytical. I think it's also important to be very open and acknowledge the fact that the field and all fields of inquiry are political all the time. And so, Serhii, you want to add to this?
Just very briefly to fully endorse your comments, Juliet, because I think the field has always been political, but it was our awareness of that developed, because prior to that, I think we moved with the field, with North American field, and we all seemed in step with each other, and everything was fine, and it was not politicization. Even so, in reality, the field reflected the trends in North American politics and culture very clearly. I think the awareness of that really was marked by renaming the association at some point, and that was most recent signal that the field is now is aware of the fact that it has always had this political function, and even the way it defined itself was political. But I think it needs to go beyond that. Because the fact that we somehow feel that things are becoming politicized now, but they were perfectly fine before, only means that we have identified with the way things have been before. We have been comfortable with that, and that is actually the problem. And as a representative of scholarship on one of the constituent non-Russian nations of the former Soviet Union, I think I have never been really comfortable with the way the field was, but I was trying to understand it and excuse it by saying, well, so many colleagues went into the field because they really liked Russia. And so I should be, more tolerant of the fact that they don't necessarily realize what they sometimes say at conferences and how they react to scholars who try to highlight the colonial dimension of Russian politics. And so the moment has arrived now with the war, when we have to, I think, to be really honest with ourselves. And I'm quoting one Ukrainian writer here who was also a very prominent politician. And being honest with ourselves would in fact involve acknowledging that the field has been political all the way. And if we didn't realize that, that is the problem with us.
Arat or Ilya, do you want to add something?
Well, not much to add on this one, except I will tell you that in Ukraine, every sphere of life now gets politicized. religion is very much politicized now. You know what's going on with Kievo-Pечерska Lavra even today and starting yesterday. And people decide which church they should go to, and they argue, and it's not only in Kiev, it's in rural areas. You know, some denominations take over the churches of other denominations, and that's all being politicized now. Many spheres of life are politicized in Ukraine. Some people are cautious over what they can say or what they cannot say, even in chats and online and everywhere. So I hope it's temporary, and Ukraine will be able to overcome this complicated period of politicization.
Thanks. Well, we're running short on time, so let me ask all three panelists, because we'd like to give our audience some a good takeaway from this. So, what if you could suggest just one thing that someone, a scholar, could do, say, work on in their university to advance the cause of decolonizing or decentering the field, what would that one thing be? What is your best advice?
I would cycle back actually to my original point from which I started. Problematize the term Russia the way you use it in your teaching in particular, but also perhaps in your scholarship. And you would see how students' eyes are suddenly like, ah, that's something new. I haven't thought about that. You've challenged them, and that would be the biggest contribution, I think.
Well, I would suggest focusing a little bit more on things like economics instead of just predominantly political science. Of course, I understand it depends on the field of study of any particular scholar, but the field has a lot of political science, not as much economics, and economics is at the end the thing that is most influential and has most impact on what's going on in the region, including this war. It has a very serious economic and business background, and there are some business interests in Russia, in Ukraine, and in the West, which define this war to a very serious degree. That's what I would suggest. Or even if you are a sociology scholar or political science, keep the economy in mind all the time. Place things in the context.
Well, as a political scientist who studies post-communist economies, I would only agree with that and point out that there are many political scientists who do exactly that. All right, Ilya.
Well, I believe in small deeds. In Abimperia, we moved to spell Russia with double S. I mean, Russians, Russian, adjective Russian with double S, referring to everything that could be spelled in Russian language as Российский. And we spell Russian with single S as Russian to designate things that are ethno-confessional specific Russian, Русские. I'm not sure that your editors would accommodate these in various publication venues, but at least try to specify in each instance you're using adjective Russian, specify it, ethnocultural Russian or political Russian referring. Every time you'll see that the tempo of writing will decrease. You will spend much more time writing your pieces. It will take you, sometimes you will be just hanging over this line for maybe 5 minutes, trying to because Russian is such an easy way to go away with intellectual, unscrupulous, rhetorical writing, while when you try to just specify this single word. And this is part of what Sergey was also suggesting. But the effect will be, if not decolonizing, but certainly very refreshing and important for critical thinking.
Right. Well, I think that's a wonderful note on which to end our conversation. Thank you so much to all three of you and to our organizers. I'll turn it back to Zsuzsa now. This has been a fantastic series, and I'm happy to have been a part of it.
Thank you very much. By way of closing, let me thank our panelists for generously sharing their insights on an incredibly complex subject, and also to the members of the audience for joining us today and posing penetrating questions. As a reminder, the series will continue next academic year, likely focused on a different topic, although I'm sure it will be well connected to this conversation. There will be a new combination of institutional hosts, the Harvard University's Davis Center and the Center for Slavic, East European and Eurasian Studies at The Ohio State University. Please keep an eye out for announcements in early September by SEEES and the two centers that will host